Pallavi. Welcome to Perspectives with Rajat.
Hi, Rajat.
Thank you for your time. I will give some in background here. You and I are friends going back quite some years. We did most of our schooling together, and we've been in and out of touch since. We've had our respective journeys. We've reconnected recently, and I thought you would make a fantastic guest for this. So thank you for doing this. And but if I can, in your own words, for our listeners, for our viewers, would you share your own story?
Yeah, sure. As you're well aware, Rajat, since you've known me for more than two-thirds of my life at this point, I grew up a little bit all over India, but a lot of the sort of latter half of my schooling in Delhi, a combination of sort of with my grandparents, my parents. My parents were in the civil service, so bounced around a fair bit. Um, I went to law school in Bangalore after that, after 12th, just when sort of India was launching the 5-year law course with an entrance exam similar to sort of the IITs and IIMs. I came back. I worked in Delhi for 2 years. Um, I mean, if I'm honest, I loved the work because India was a very, very exciting time. I mean, my chosen practice area was capital markets. This is 2004. India was obviously just beginning to take off in terms of the first access to markets by big companies. The first deal I ever worked on was Tata Consultancy Services, which was India's first billion-dollar IPO, and there have been so many more since. So I love working with Indian clients. I love working in the markets in India. Didn't so much love working in Delhi as a city. So I think I looked around, and foreign law firms are not allowed to operate in India. Still are not. It's still a closed sector. So I sort of looked around for opportunities that would allow me to continue working with the Indian markets and Indian clients, but I mean, just go overseas, gain some international experience, live elsewhere. The idea was to always come back to India at some point, of course. Um, but then, life happened, never came back. So I picked Singapore because actually a lot of work at that point in time, it was becoming clear that Singapore was a bit of a hub to India in terms of the flow of capital and the market. So I ended up being based here, and this is where I've been for the last 18 plus years. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you for that. There's a lot to pick at in that. We could have interesting conversations on maybe a dozen things from in there. Well, let me start at the beginning, maybe. You're an only child.
Yes.
Your parents were in the civil service, kept moving around. How was that formative? What's been the experience like? And you had the chance to actually deliberate on how this is different from some of our peers who have siblings. You and I have had this discussion separately as well. So how is being an only child, and two being a child of parents who move around frequently? How has that shaped you from a personality perspective? What imprints do you see in your professional career and your personal career from that?
I think, I mean, as you know, in our generation, being an only child was still a pretty unique set of circumstances. There weren't too many of us in school or elsewhere. I think there are a lot more now when I look around at our friends and their kids. There are a lot more only children in the mix. But in our sort of time in school, people had at least one, if not two, other siblings. I think it was probably even rarer to be an only daughter. That was definitely a sort of, some people signed off when they had a son and they were like, one and done is fine if it's a boy. Girls were definitely rarer. I think I was quite lucky in the sense that my parents really didn't seem to sort of care too much. It wasn't, maybe it's because my family's from Kerala. There wasn't sort of any hard wiring around sort of, it's never been a state known for its very highly positive birth rates, at least not in a very long time. I think my parents were always quite keen that I was quite a bookworm growing up. I think that's a logical corollary of being an only child. You were to an extent treated like a mini adult. You learn to entertain yourself, all of that. But my parents were still quite focused on the fact that they wanted me to be social, have meaningful friendships, not be overly sort of introverted. So they pushed, but I would still say I came out of my shell when I went to law school. That's where I was like, okay, living away from parents was the first step there. Um, the second part of that is, again, because they had transferable jobs, and by the time I got to being about sort of 8 or 9 years, which is when I came back to Delhi permanently, so to speak, I had already been in about 6 different schools. I'd been in CBSE, I'd been in Gujarat board, I'd been in others. So I think that's the point at which they said, look, this kid needs some stability. She's, at one point I'd also lost a year between switching boards and sort of schools. They were like, this can't happen, which is when Springdale sort of took me in and I moved in with my grandparents. So in hindsight, I think I used to say growing up that, I'm never going to be in a transferable job. I used to hate it so much being the new kid on the first day at school. I used to be like, I'm never doing this. I'm moving to a city and I'm staying there forever, which I have done in Singapore, but I've moved homes here about every 5 years. So I didn't do so well. So maybe the restlessness is rooted somewhere deep down. I would say professionally, it's held me in good stead because I'm quite okay in the sense of being comfortable in new situations or with new people. I'm okay entering a room and trying to make conversation with people. I'm also okay standing in a corner and just sort of people watching if no one wants to talk to me. I think that just comes from having been the new kid in school about 6 times over by the time you're 9 years old. So yeah, mixed bag. But I don't think the apple has fallen that far from the tree because, like I said, I've moved homes every 3 or 4 years. I travel a lot. So the only thing I've managed to do is stay in one city/country.
When did you know you wanted to be a lawyer?
Around, I think, 11th standard, not before that. I think if you remember, I kind of picked medicine as my stream. I think I've spent 1 week in medicine before I realized I really didn't have the stomach. I think, honestly, if I'm honest, I only picked it because my best friend picked it, and that seemed like a good reason. But 1 week in, I think
I
it was
picked
clear
it
to me
because
that.
your best friend too.
Sorry?
I'm saying I only picked it because your best friend picked it too. So it's okay.
Correct. So I think she knew her mind since she was in class 5, and it seemed like a great idea for everyone who didn't to follow in her footsteps because she was so convinced it was the right thing. But I think 1 week and maybe the first frog in, I was like, okay, this is stupid. I have no aptitude for this. I have no, um, and I sort of went back and I said, look, I think humanities is my temperature more than it was in commerce. And as you know, there was a perception when we were in school that humanities was not the stream you went to if you
Oh,
wanted
I'm
to be.
ready. I'm ready for
Sorry?
the soliloquy. I'm ready for the soliloquy. Go
this
for it.
is this is going to get me into trouble. But there was definitely a perception that humanities was not the stream you went into if you were aspiring for sort of success, right? And so yeah, the school called my parents and they said, look, we don't know what this kid is doing. She's shown up. She says she wants to change streams. I mean, luckily for me, my dad had done his master's in English literature. My mother had done political science from LSR. So as a family, there was strong sort of roots towards literature, humanities. So they weren't terribly phased by it. The only position they negotiated with me, they asked that I keep maths and economics to keep options open, which I was happy to do. And I think that's when I started thinking about I wanted to do journalism. My dad did the classic Indian parent thing, which is he really didn't want me to do journalism, but he said, how about you get a professional degree and then you go into doing journalism? So my parents are masters at sort of negotiating as if they're going to give you what you want. And I still fall for it at the age of 44, as if they're going to give you what you want. And then you realize, like, their entire plan was to kick the can down the road. And so yeah, so at that point I had cousins in law school. It was a relatively new course in India, but the syllabus sounded really interesting. You only kind of got to full law by the time you were in your second year. Until then, you did a mix of law and humanities courses. So I really wrote the entrance exam in a lark. I mean, even at that point, if you'd asked me, do you want to be a corporate lawyer? Do you know what you want to do at the end of law school?
Hmm.
I would have said no. I mean, I didn't do my first proper corporate law internship until my 5th year, and then I really enjoyed it. Law was more, it was more a process of elimination. What can I not do? And that I feel categorically I will not enjoy. And once you took all that off the list, law was what my parents were most in favor of.
Okay. So one, I really enjoy you going off on our schooling system and some of the schools in particular. So I'm
Yeah,
going to revisit that a little bit. But
sure.
also, I'd be very surprised if kids in the 11th standard knew what they wanted to do with their lives. Right? One, I
What
don't
did
think
she knew she wanted to be a doctor from 5th grade onwards or something?
handful of kids, right?
Yeah.
And I think for some of those, we've actually questioned whether that was a decision that was made with a basis or that was just a decision that they committed to and then just stuck with it, say out of inertia, right? But that is not to say there is a right way to make that decision or a wrong way. But to get to a consensus there, to get to a decision that this is what you want to do for the rest of your life, that's huge. And I don't think any 16-year-old, 17-year-old is fully equipped to make that decision.
I agree with
On
you.
right.
I think the 5 year course in India for law is a great thing. I think it's an incredible amount of pressure because you're going into something at age 17 for 5 years,
Mm.
and most of the universities don't allow you to split the degree. So you're in there, it's not like you can leave in 3 years with a BA and revisit your options. I don't know if they do now, but in our time, they didn't. So if you were in for 5 years or no degree. And I think that's a lot of pressure to put on a 17-year-old to pick a professional path at that age.
But you also said that was a good thing. Was that a good thing for you, or do you think that's structurally a good thing?
For me, it was a good thing because I felt like I was sort of escaping the pressures of all the other things I didn't want to do, and at least
Hmm.
getting to do something I did enjoy, the humanities sort of parts of the courses. And I think a lot of it, Rajat, at that age is also dumb luck. I stumbled into the right internships. I did well at those internships. I finally discovered I did enjoy corporate law. Up until
Hmm.
my fifth year, I thought I was going to litigate. And then I did one corporate internship again at my dad's insistence just to round off your CV. Whereas I'm pretty sure he was going, please, please, please let my only child pick corporate law and not the Sazari. But very cleverly engineered. How can it hurt to have a rounded sort of worldview? Uh, and it worked out. But the truth is, I mean, looking back, it doesn't work out for everyone. There's a huge element of just dumb luck. um, to expect a kid coming, in many cases, at least in our time, from a non-law background, because that is really what the 5 year courses were meant to do, open up the profession to talent, to make the right choices and say, a lot of people I know, very talented people, have gone on to do other incredible things from law school, but have not stuck with the practice of law.
Hmm. Okay. I see a lot of there is maybe an overrepresentation of lawyers in certain professions that are not really law professions. So a lot of our parliamentarians, the
Yeah.
ones who have professional degrees, tend to have legal degrees. A lot of CAs seem to have clubbed LLBs with their professional degrees. What is
Yeah.
it about the law that is either attractive or empowering to these people, do you think?
I think the law, even if you don't intend to practice as a lawyer, I think the law as a profession is complementary and rounds off a lot of other professions. So frankly, if you have an accountancy degree in law as a professional, frankly, you're pretty invincible. I mean, if you're the CFO of a company that has a law and an accountancy degree, in terms of sort of rounding you off for that job, I can't think of anyone who's sort of better placed to do that. You also have a lot of people who go into journalism, into writing, into who have a law, because again, the skills of analytical research, reading, writing are taught well to lawyers. If you spent a few years in the profession, the odds are you write better than the average person, just in terms of presentation, clarity of thoughts, assuming you've been trained properly. So as a professional choice, I mean, it's obviously always been closely linked to political science, international relations. So it's a natural sort of launch pad for politics in general. And that goes back to, if you look at the freedom movement, I think a lot of the International Congress, the freedom fighters had law degrees. That was the base of sort of it has traditionally, there are colleges that have been a hotbed of sort of political activism and free speech and thought, and it's always fed into that sort of both internationally and in India. So it's a profession that the skills there can be molded to a lot of other things, is how I put it. Depends on what you want to do with it.
Hmm. Okay, makes a lot of sense. Um, so post coming to Singapore, right? So compare and contrast, because you said this in the beginning that you enjoyed working in the firms that you did, but you didn't really enjoy working in Delhi.
Yeah.
So let's pick on that a little bit. Compare and contrast life and working in Delhi with life and working in Singapore.
The work was largely the same. The hours were long. As I said, it was a nascent, relatively speaking, market for capital markets. Clients were demanding. It was very exciting because we were actually developing sort of new practice that till today companies that IPO go ahead and follow as sort of best practice in the market. There was a lot of regulatory rulemaking that was coming out of SEBI and the RBI at the time that was facilitating sort of deal making in India. The FDI policy was literally being rewritten every 3 months to sort of prescribe which sectors. Like I worked on Jet Airways IPO when they got their permission to start flying overseas. So FDI policy in sectors was literally being opened up, and you were IPOing these companies as you went along. So all of that was very similar. I mean, except that obviously in India I was practicing Indian law, and overseas I was practicing sort of English law. Um, I think the main thing was just in terms of again, probably going to get in trouble for this, but in India, the one thing I realized, at least when I was working, and bear in mind, this was pre-metro, pre maybe a lot of guardrails that exist today. There was a constant at like 7 p.m. I'd be looking at my watch and sort of, oh, my dad would call me 6 times and be like, not that we're telling you to come home, you must do the best job you want to do, but can you just call us and let us know when you want to be picked up, right? And he would do that till 2 a.m., 3 a.m., whatever. There was a genuine sense, at least for me, that you can say all you want about equality and all of that, but if you have a male lawyer and a female lawyer at a certain stage of their career, and the guy is just clocking up that many more hours of experience, or even frankly, the partners want to give the guy work after 7 p.m. because they don't want to be the one who sort of held a female lawyer back in office past 8 p.m. from a place of genuinely decency or whatever. I was like, this isn't really tenable. It's a level of stress over and above working, what was at that point, 17, 18 hours a day. And that was certainly a driver in the move to Singapore. And I remember saying to a friend after sort of, 1 month of being in Singapore, I said, for the first time ever, I realize what guys have, which is the privilege of being completely invisible. The privilege of walking on the streets and just no one pays attention to you beyond whether, I mean, if they need something from you or you're in their way or you need to flag a cab, sure, they'll pay attention to you. But just to not have the male gaze and just go about your life as just another person on the street, that to me was a completely novel experience. I mean, Bangalore, to be fair, but we were mostly on campus in Bangalore, so that was a different experience. But Delhi, at least back in the day, was not like that.
What's been your experience in Singapore?
Sorry?
What's been your experience in Singapore then? How has Singapore been? So not to differentiate it, but just life in Singapore, how has it been for you?
I mean, it's a great place to live. It's obviously very safe, very comfortable. I mean, I have honestly no complaints. I mean, when I came out here sometime back in the day, I don't think people say it anymore, but they'd be like, oh, compared to Hong Kong or Tokyo, this is definitely more anodyne or more safe. I loved it. As far as I was concerned, if you were finishing work at 2 a.m. and you could get in a taxi and you fall asleep in the back seat of the taxi, and the driver would literally wake you up when you got to your apartment, I was like, you guys have no idea what you're talking about. This is a huge privilege. Don't take it for granted. So I have always loved living and working here. And I think, obviously, as an only child, one of the things I also really love is the proximity to India. And the fact that in 5 hours, I can be there if my parents need me or anything. So that's definitely also a factor in the decision long term to have stayed here.
There's 3 of you at home. What can you share about the other 2?
The other 2. So the two-legged one is a professor of economics. He's a lawyer by training. So he's in that bucket of people who did sort of 5 years of law at ILS, and then graduated and then realized this really wasn't for him. As in, his father was a senior counsel. He did it because there were other lawyers in the family, and completely switched streams and went to LSE and worked at sort of getting a master's and a PhD and is now an academic. The four-legged one has no degrees, but makes up for it on the good looks quota. So that's the Ogladu. Has 0 skills, but will con you out of every treat you're holding.
Your Instagram is completely a Ladu account, right?
He has his own account. Frankly, I have my account and I could go months without posting and no one would notice. But actually, if he doesn't put up a post at regular frequencies, I get messages saying, is everything okay with him? So.
Oh, well done. Well done. Okay. So private markets, public markets, what's been your experience between, say, deals going, between companies going public in India and companies going public here based out of Singapore? So whom do you advise when you're based out of Singapore? And I'm assuming you were advising only Indian companies when you were back in India. So how is that experience?
I've predominantly 80-85% of my practice is still advising Indian companies, but Indian companies who want to, and typically these days, obviously the desire is to list in India, but market the shares to US investors as well. So there was a time where obviously Indian companies regularly explored listing in the US. The UK was briefly a popular option. Over time, we've seen occasionally companies, explore sort of REITs or business trusts in Singapore, Dubai. But I'd say right now, for the last few years, the trend has very much been listing in India, but marketing the shares to US investors. So that's typically, the situations I get involved in, which is advising on their liability if they're accessing US investors, what regimes they can use or what exemptions they can use to do that while continuing to list in India, and helping them craft their disclosure. But 85% of my work is still Indian companies or groups.
Okay, let's pick at this a little bit. Why has there now been a trend to increasingly list in India when earlier firms were more agnostic?
So, a couple of things. So, I think earlier, so there's been the whole wave of which you're well aware of, sort of fintech, or what SEBI likes to call new age tech companies, right, for their purposes, NATCs. I think a lot of these companies, when they were incorporated or started operations a few years ago, uh, they were told, look, your businesses are not businesses that Indian investors or the regulator will understand. They're frankly too funky. India is still a bricks and mortar sort of business um, environment. You should be looking at listing in the US mostly, because that's where investors will understand what you do. I think what has happened over a period of time is, of course, just the exponential growth in the markets is that the regulators are a lot more sophisticated, investors are a lot more sophisticated. There have been any number of sort of, so-called digital sort of businesses. I mean, as a firm, we acted on the Go Digit IPO. I'm working with a couple of companies now. Um, there's just been, I mean, the regulator gets you. They have put guardrails around disclosure and all of that for these companies, but they absolutely get the business. There's no question about that. So, in terms of valuation and receptiveness, India is frankly the better home for these companies. The other thing that bankers will tell us is also in terms of research and analyst coverage. Um, in India, you are obviously a much better profile name in your own home market as opposed to being a mid-size or small-size listed company in the US. So, in terms of ongoing coverage and sort of attention from analysts, you're much better placed today listing in India. So, there's any number of sort of companies now looking to flip back or do a flip into India of their operations and move their whole co back to India and list in India. So it's really just been a sea change in the growth of the market and the kind of businesses the market has come to regularly recognize as being valuable.
But is the market as mature as, or 80% as mature as, say, the American market?
Let's be very clear, it's an emerging market. For an emerging market, it is a very sophisticated market. In the region, we regularly get questions from other regulators, rule makers, on how has India approached X or Y. It is a very, very sophisticated market in that sense, with a very proactive regulator who actively watches out for the interests of retail investors and how sort of information is presented to them. Is it fair to compare it to the US, where this industry is decades old in terms of rulemaking and how investors? I don't think that's fair. You're talking about an industry that is about as old as my career, give or take 20 years. But in terms of how it's grown, where it ranks today as a global equities market, that's just incredible. I don't think, maybe outside of Hong Kong, China, there's ever been a market that's grown at that pace.
Okay, that's fair. Thank you. Give you advise a number of public listings. What do founders get right, and what do they get most wrong most often when they're going public?
So that's very interesting. So I think obviously, almost I would say any situation in an IPO context can possibly be unraveled and sort of visited and redone for purposes of the IPO, whether it is recasting your financials in a certain way, re-domiciling the company from overseas to India, dealing with tax considerations, all of that. Um, I think the impact always is on timelines. So, depending on what window of the market you want to catch, you can do anything if you have 18 months to 2 years, the preparatory runway. I think depending on what window of the market you want to catch, your level of preparedness and how much you address those issues has an impact. So, if you come and say, look, we want to list by February 2025, but we've not looked at our 3 years accounts, we haven't started a restatement process. Frankly, there's a redomicile question. If we have a redomicile question, we have shareholders overseas who now need to be based into the Indian entity. What are the tax implications of a redomicile? You're not going to get there by February 2025. So I think the main thing is that the smartest promoters I've seen are the ones who sit down and go through those issues, including with new age tech companies, the ones who have many series of financings in terms of what their investors want, and arrive at what is a realistic exit timeline, start preparing towards it, and then you catch the window you want.
Okay, there are multiple pressures on the organization itself when it's going public,
Absolutely.
what do you recommend in terms of when when is a firm ready to go public ideally, and when would you like them to be ready?
So,
What
I
are the
mean,
markers for the milestones?
the readiness is, I mean, it really depends from industry to industry. For your typical tech company, it is at what point usually are you turning sort of profit positive, beginning to show returns, or the market is receptive particularly to your kind of business and your peers are listing and you're seeing sort of good valuations. Readiness can mean different things to different sort of promoters. Obviously the pressure in terms of the questions the regulator will ask and your sort of disclosure are different if you're not profitable, so you have to be prepared for that is going to be a part of how you explain that away. But a big part of readiness and when you want to do it for most companies is there's the promoters or the founders. There's also the investors. If there are, more often than not today in India, you have a PE fund or other investors sort of invested in different stages of the company's life cycle. Arriving at a clear timetable that everyone is bought into is a key part of how you determine readiness.
So what's the process typically like? So do these stakeholders get around the table once? Do you facilitate these conversations? How does this work?
A lot of these conversations are usually happening in the background with the banks, and it may take more than one meeting to get everyone on the same page because all investors, depending on what price point they came into the company, may not be completely aligned in terms of sort of the guy who came in 5 years ago at a much lower price is probably the keenest to exit because he's going to see the maximum return on what he came in at, and he's ready to free up his capital and take it to another sort of nascent company. The guy who came in only, or girl who came in only 18 months ago, obviously will have a different view in terms of whether they're ready for an exit or not. Getting everyone aligned, and frankly, not everyone may decide to be a selling shareholder in an IPO. That's
Hmm.
also a question to resolve with the bank. Some people may decide to continue to hold. You have to see as between the promoters and the selling shareholders, can you get to the minimum 10% float that's required for an IPO? And is everyone who has to be a part of that process at least committed to taking it forward?
Got it. Okay. What was the most interesting or exacting deal that you worked on? Without, if you don't want to name names, don't name names, but give us the goss.
Uh, I mean, honestly, I can't name names because I used to work with this partner years ago who once said to me very wisely, he said, the most difficult or demanding deal of your career is the one you're doing right now. And I think that's 100% right. Once the company lists and you've gone to the listing ceremony and the gong has been rung, it's a bit like childbirth. Everyone eradicates the bad memories and you move on to the next deal. The most difficult deal is always the one you're trying to get over the line just at present.
So there's a guy, and then there's you with who doesn't have a child. For us to be having that conversation, it's a little bit okay.
But
But
that's
okay.
exactly what a partner of mine who did have children positioned it as. He said the worst deal of your career, the most difficult one, the most demanding one is whatever you're doing at the moment. That's got your 100% attention. That's the one that's growing over the line, keeping you awake. Once a deal is successfully done, everyone's happy.
Does it get easier? Does it get more complicated? What happens is as so how does Pallavi's involvement in a deal change over the 20-year career that she's had?
So every deal is different. I still regularly get hit with issues that I haven't seen before, but thankfully not too regularly, but it certainly happens about once every deal. I mean, obviously when I
Mhm.
started my career, a lot of it was being locked in a data room, doing due diligence and sort of, making up checklists and issues lists for someone else to look at. 20 years later, I'm the person who looks, somebody brings me those issues or raises it to me. And my involvement is to take a call on whether something is material or important or needs to be sort of presented back to the company or the underwriters. So obviously, my role has dramatically sort of changed over the years. But every deal still regularly throws up new issues. I think what happens with the passage of time is your judgment obviously hones itself, even if it's a new issue, how you react to it um, changes, right? What might have panicked you as a third or a fourth year associate. At 20 years, you're like, okay, let's take a step back. Let's go back to the first principles. I may not have seen this issue before, but I have 20 years of experience to come at this with and form a judgment. And you're much more comfortable in your own skin on the judgment you're making and much more willing to defend that judgment. So that's, I think, the biggest change. And honestly, there's no substitute. It comes to everyone in their careers. There's no substitute to just having done the hard sort of years in the trenches.
So you're currently partner and joint chair of the India group at A&O Shearman. A&O Shearman itself is the result of a merger between two very large firms, Allen Overy and Sherman Sterling.
That's right.
With as much detail as you are allowed to share, what was the experience like going through a merger like that? And uh, are there any learnings for the rest of us?
I mean, I think it's the first merger ever of its size in the legal industry. I mean, the legal industry largely tends to be much more disparate in terms of the number of major firms you have than, for example, the big four or consulting. So I think it's the first sort of merger that has resulted in a properly transatlantic firm of this size and scale. Um, I would say in many respects, like any other M&A deal, I mean, the lawyers had their own advisors, the lawyers had lawyers. It was approached very much as the marquee deal that it was in the market. Um, I think going in, obviously, there was a lot of excitement as a firm. There still is in terms of what the sort of what this means for us. But there were many firsts, just because no one has ever done it on this scale before. There were many, many firsts in terms of how you approach things, how you approach integration, how you approach conflicts, which, for example, in law firms is a big thing, how you approach sort of panel appointments. There were any number of issues sort of that had to be ironed out and, which have largely today been ironed out. But like any other big M&A, integration will be a process of a year or two of, people coming together and working under the same roof. But today, 6 months on, it feels pretty much like it's very well underway.
You have new colleagues that you think that you've had. Does it feel like you've had enduring relationships with them? What's been the human cost or outcomes or benefits of the merger?
I think in terms of at least in human terms, I think people have been very warm and welcoming. I think both ways. I think one of the reasons this was the merger that happened is culturally the firms are very similar in terms of the types of client, their sort of temperament towards working with colleagues, how they approach the markets. So overall, I'd say it's been a very collaborative experience. Obviously, and people have been very open on both sides of the table to setting down new approaches or how things could be done or best practices on both sides. People have been very good in sort of, for want of a better term, hunting in packs, going to clients together, marketing the joint sort of platform. So I certainly have not had any adverse experiences.
Got it. So last thing, you are the joint chair of the India group. What does that mean? What does that entail?
So as I mentioned earlier, law as an area is still not one where we can practice in India. It remains a closed area. So, the big four are there, the consulting firms are there, law remains largely closed. There has been some buzz over the last sort of 18 months as to it may open up, there may be a time frame to do that. But as of now, as on the date that we're recording this, there are no rules that facilitate that. Um, but what that means is we have a very large India practice because Indian clients, of course, regularly need New York law or English law, Singapore law advice because a lot of the contracts they enter into are governed by those laws or international commercial arbitration, for example, in cross-border matters. What we do is effectively headquartered in Singapore, but with the presence in other offices like London or Dubai or New York. We run a sort of virtual India office, for want of a better word. This is over 100 lawyers globally who focus in their different practice areas on India. India is a priority for these lawyers, whether it's M&A or capital markets or leverage finance or arbitration or fund formation. These are lawyers who are committed to that country and have a deep depth of experience in doing the offshore law piece. We can't obviously practice the Indian law piece, so we work alongside Indian law firms to do that. But what I do together with my co-chair Sheila is basically help manage that group, help manage our relationships with clients, workflows, our relationships with law firms on the ground. All of that is within our remit.
Lovely. How long have you been chair?
Over just over 3 years.
Oh, lovely. Okay. Yeah, that's all I have. The last time you and I met,
Yeah,
I think we just drank wine and gossiped.
correct.
Uh, I will leave you with one set of initials that I think we discussed at that time. VJ.
Yeah.
Does it strike a chord?
No, should it?
Cool, cool. No, very good that it doesn't. Fantastic. But I'll leave you with that. Yes, it did. It just did, didn't it?
No, no, I'm still.
Okay, lovely. Okay, I'll message you separately. But anyway. But thank you so much. Much love also to the two-legged and the four-legged one at home,
Thank
right?
you.
And thank you so much for your time.
Been lovely. Thank you.
Bye.